turn up your mind.
Something's wrong. Those chilling words were uttered last night by a medical technician present at the execution of Clayton Lockett, when it dawned on officials that their experimental new drug cocktail, designed to put Lockett to death, was not working. 10 minutes after the execution began, a doctor declared Clayton Lockett was unconscious. But at 6:36, Lockett began writhing. Minutes later, it started getting particularly ugly.
Reporter Graham Lee Brewer of the Oklahoman was one of the official witnesses.
He began kicking his feet, lifting his head and his chest off the gurney, grimacing, clenching his teeth, and in a couple of moments he actually mumbled.
At 6:39, a prison official said to witnesses, "We are going to lower the blinds temporarily," and they did. It was clear at that point to officials in attendance that something was very, very wrong.
After conferring with the warden and unknown how much drugs had went into him, it was my decision at that time to stop the execution.
According to an AP reporter in attendance, prison officials said they would try to get Lockett to the hospital to resuscitate him, the man that they were just moments ago trying to kill. Well, they did not succeed in resuscitating him. At 7:06 p.m., Clayton Lockett was declared dead. He died of a heart attack 43 minutes after the drug was administered. A gruesome period of what can only be described as torture by incompetence. Although when you look at the full context of this execution, when you zoom back and take it all in, incompetence is far, far too gentle a term. Something more like sinister, insistent, willful malice is more apt. And no one is more central to that story of malice than Republican Governor Mary Fallin, who last night was forced to stay the execution of a second prisoner set to be executed that night, after she pushed and pushed to go ahead with last night's executions against all warnings and due process. Today, she promised an investigation into the botched execution she herself had so zealously advocated. The two men who were scheduled to be killed last night were found guilty of crimes so unspeakably horrible and repugnant, they deserve the harshest penalty a humane society metes out. Well, Oklahoma, they have the death penalty. And the state was intent on putting them to death. But here's the thing. Oklahoma is having trouble finding the drugs to kill its inmates.
Yeah, what a disgusting story to start a show with, right? But we do need to talk about it. So, welcome to the Thursday edition of the Randi Rhodes Show. I'm Nicole Sandler of RadioOrNot.com, in for Randi today. She will be back Monday to bring us into the home stretch. But there are some important issues that we do need to discuss. And I'll tell you something. There is a reason that I'm going to talk about this story, this story about a botched execution. And the Republicans, the Senate Republicans, filibustering the vote to open debate on raising this nation's minimum wage. You know what the connecting thread is here? Let's see if you can figure it out. 866-87-RANDY. 866-877-2634, because there is a definite connection here. But let's start. See if you can figure it out. We'll get there, but if we'll take you if you think you got it. Starting with this botched execution. This murderer and rapist who was scheduled to be executed the night before last, Clayton Lockett. I can't imagine anybody who more deserves to die a heinous death than him. His crimes were so sickening. One of them, a teenage victim of his, he buried her alive in a shallow grave, and I guess watched, waiting for her to die. He apparently, I can't find this right now, but I read that he raped and then murdered his girlfriend's 11-month-old baby. I mean, look, if ever somebody deserved to be executed, and in a horrible way, it's probably him. The question is, in this day and age, it is the year 2014, is the practice of executing a prisoner something that we should be doing? Now, let me, tell you why I'm conflicted about this. Because if it were my daughter who was raped and buried alive in a shallow grave, you better believe not only would I want the rapist and murderer killed, I'd want to do it myself with my own bare hands. But, I think about that, and then I think about the statistic that tell us about how many people on death row are actually innocent. And it's enough to make a statistical, difference there. I think about Troy Davis. You remember Troy Davis? For a couple of weeks there, wow, he was on everyone's mind. We were all Troy Davis, remember, on the interwebs. I am Troy Davis. We put up his picture as our avatar. We stood firm because this was a man who was fingered by the actual murderer. And there was enough evidence for most of us to believe in his innocence, and he was still executed by the state of Georgia. And that happens all too often. So on the one hand, we have this barbaric principle. I still remember my mother and her admonitions. 2 wrongs don't make a right. 2 wrongs don't make a right. And I'll tell you something else. I would imagine that being locked up in a tiny cell with no privileges and no rights and no freedom, that's really lack of freedom, being locked in a tiny cell with no way out, no hope of parole, no hope of ever seeing daylight again. I can imagine that that would be a worse punishment than being let out of your misery. Once you're dead, you're dead. Sorry, you're dead. I understand there are some people who believe that heaven and hell and all that. But from what we know, what science tells us, sorry, you're dead, you're dead. You're put out of your misery. I want these miserable criminals to live every moment knowing that those heinous acts they committed put them there. I want them to remember the horrible things they did. And being made to live out your life in a tiny cell, I think that's pretty good punishment. I'm wondering, is it time to end this barbaric practice? In that piece we just played, which was the opening segment on All In with Chris Hayes last night, he talked about the barbaric nature of that execution. Rachel Maddow did a similar thing, only she went through the history of the methods that we have used in the past to execute prisoners. From hanging to firing squad. She talked about Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore, another heinous murderer, was given a choice of how he wanted to die, and he chose the firing squad. The firing squad. And then, we outgrew those. We realized, oh, God, those are pretty barbaric. A hanging death. Sometimes death didn't come instantly. Sometimes the person being executed would be, hanging by their heads and just writhing and suffering and maybe breaking a neck but not quite dying. So, and of course, firing squad, that's kind of messy. Someone's got to clean that up, right? Mm-hmm. Then we went to the electric chair. Remember old Sparky? Yeah, except, the people that would witness these executions would tell of the sick nature of electrocuting someone to death, just burning people alive. I mean, in essence, is what you're doing there. So now they come up with the lethal injection. In practice, in theory, I guess it should work. We've all, I would guess, all us pet owners, pet lovers, have been in the sad predicament, the sad situation of having to put a pet down, a pet that you love, that you've loved for years. It's part of your family, and we want to end the suffering. I had to do it with my dog Pooh just last summer, and I hate to say it, it's coming up with Sasha, her sister, because she's not doing well. But I know that the vet will first give her a sedative, and it'll calm her down, and she'll fall asleep. And then the next shot stops her heart. I've had to do it twice before. I'm dreading the next time. But it seems like that isn't as peaceful as when we put human beings down. And what has happened is it seems the rest of the world has sort of matured around us. There's no European country left that has the death penalty. None. And that's why we find ourselves in this predicament. The states, I think there's still 38 or 39 of them, that have the death penalty can no longer get the drugs that they had used previously for this lethal cocktail. I think the first one sedates you. The second one paralyzes you. The third one stops your heart. Okay, but they can't get those drugs anymore because the drug manufacturers will not sell them to the states for the purpose of executing someone. So they're left to their own devices to try to find a new and effective way to kill a human being, even if it is a human being as heinous as this rapist and murderer, who was so heinous even his stepmother thought he should be executed. Now, look, I mean, the entire act of executing somebody is barbaric in and of itself. So is there really a distinction between executing someone humanely or just, killing them because they're rapists and murderers and shouldn't live? Have you thought about the connection yet? All right, I'll tell you what. We'll take a break here. We'll come back on the other side. I'll give you the connection between killing even the worst examples of people walking the earth, killing the worst of the worst criminals out there, and the Republican Party in the Senate, yesterday's Senate Republicans filibustering the motion to open debate on raising the minimum wage in this country. It's pretty stunning, but it all goes together. All right. 866-87-RANDY is the number. 866-877-2634. Nicole Sandler in for Randi Rhodes. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Randi Rhodes on Premier Radio Networks.
Well, today you got Nicole Sandler in for Randi Rhodes, and I opened up talking about this story that I actually stayed away from yesterday because I couldn't wrap my brain around it. As much as I think somebody who rapes and murders anyone, but my God, children, the most despicable creatures on the planet, don't deserve to live, is it our responsibility as a nation, as a society, to kill them? Is that the right punishment? Again, as my mother drilled into me when I was a kid, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Just because someone did something bad to you doesn't mean that you should do something bad back to them. And a better punishment, as I said, would be locking them up with no chance of seeing sunlight ever again. Or as, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Peropomaska something on Twitter just tweeted me, at Nicole Sandler. Executions are not meant to be pretty. And what about the victims from these 2 scumbags? Did they die pretty? Or I like Peary 85. Murderers should be made to spend the rest of their lives diagramming Palin's sentences. That's a good one. And as for the question as to what the connection is between, not only our practice of executing people, but the fact that, they botched the execution, can't even get that right, the connection, interesting, Brian in Miami on Twitter says the connection is poor and brown. All right, we're getting there. That's part of it. The part of it is, yes, that if you look at who's on death row, you're right. Most of those people will be poor and brown. Because if you are wealthy and white, you can kill people and get off with a defense of affluenza. Yeah. We have people in Congress who do not care about you if you are poor or brown. We have people in Congress in leadership positions. You've got Paul Ryan, who in this piece that in an interview he did back in March that prompted his meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus that lasted all of probably 15 minutes yesterday. and nothing was done. Not even an apology was made. In that interview, I'll just play one little clip from the soundbite.
This tailspin or spiral that we're looking at in our communities. You know, your buddy Charles Murray or Bob Putnam over at Harvard, those guys have written books on this, which is we have got this tailspin of culture in our inner cities in particular.
Yeah. So the tailspin of culture. He's talking about the black community. And Charles Murray, who's written books about how blacks are inferior to we whites, biologically, intellectually inferior. That's who he quotes, because that's what they think of you. And if you're just a poor, lazy black person living in poverty, well, gee, that's your own fault, isn't it? Why should we, help you? Or, as Rick Santorum actually had a moment of clarity. I know it doesn't happen very often, but he did. He nailed it.
People ask me, do Republicans care much about the poor as Democrats do? Yeah. I'm not sure we do. Yeah, and guess what? I'm sure you don't. And that, my friends, is the connection. They don't care about you. And and they're hypocrites on top of it. That's the other part. These people who are, kill them. The pro-death penalty people are the same people who call themselves pro-life. And I don't know how anyone who is in favor of executing anybody can call themselves pro-life. You know what? I believe in a woman's right to choose what's right for her body, for her family, for her future, and for this, thing that's growing inside her body that if she, decides to carry to term will become her baby. It's a woman's right to choose. And they're called, that makes me pro-life. I am pro-life. I believe in our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But those same people who call themselves pro-life, who are so quick to say, kill him. Do you remember the debate with Rick Perry? And they talked about how many people he had executed in Texas that year, and the crowd went wild. Because he put people to death. And the follow-up question was, do you ever worry about, you're going to execute an innocent man? No, I don't worry about that. Do you think Troy Davis should have worried about that? Because I do. Again, I can't imagine anyone who deserved a heinous death more than the guy whose execution was botched the other day. And then, the insanity of the whole thing. So they botch the execution. He doesn't die. He's suffering. They take him to the hospital and try to resuscitate him. Why? So they could kill him again? And they couldn't kill him, so he died. My brain wants to explode because it's insane. You want to talk about barbarians? That's what we are. We are barbaric in that we do this. Maybe you can free up some space in the prisons by letting out the people, who got busted during a stop and frisk for carrying a couple of joints. Victimless crime perpetrators who are now serving ridiculous prison sentences, and lock up the violent criminals. Now, put them on an island somewhere, like an old leper colony. That's fine. But should we be killing them? And should the people who are killing them be wearing their pro-life credentials on their sleeves? I think not. Nicole for Randy. We'll be right back. Well, it is Nicole Sandler in for Randy. She'll be back Monday. And so, all right, so we were just talking about the boxed execution. That should be a good nickname for the Republicans, botched execution. It's how they do everything. We were talking about that. We were talking about their disdain for the poor and people of color, right? They just don't get it. I'll tell you, my favorite tweet so far that has come in response to what we've been talking about so far comes from Tom Adler on Twitter. The right is not in favor of life. They're in favor of a government's right to choose. Badum. So look, they are in favor of, deciding what's right and wrong. Okay. And most importantly, I think, keeping their children away from
oh, maybe those poor, children of color, I guess. There's a really sad trend happening in this country. Let me back up a little bit and tell you I am the product of the public school system. I was born in New York, went through 6th grade at PS 169 in Queens. Did fine. Moved to Florida to start 7th grade. And though I was way ahead of all the kids in my classes when I moved to Florida, I quickly fell back, right? But I made it through. I went through the public schools. I went to the University of South Florida. I had a public education, and I think I turned out okay. There is, of late, I've seen this vilification of teachers unions, and a push to privatize public education that I think is terribly dangerous. A little later, I'll tell you about my experience with my daughter in using some of those public funds to help pay for a private school education, and how badly that worked out for us. But I first want to bring in a friend. Her name is Sabrina Joy Stevens. On Twitter, she's at Teacher Sabrina. Teacher Sabrina, Executive Director of Integrity in Education. Their website is integrityineducation.org. And on Twitter, they are EDU Integrity. Sabrina Stevens, thanks for joining me today on the Randi Rhodes Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. I'm having a hard time spitting it out. But let me say this. You were a teacher. You taught 4th grade. You're one of the gutsiest women I know, because I've seen you get up and speak truth to power in situations where it may not have been comfortable. And you decided, right, you needed to do something. So you formed this group, Integrity in Education, and you say that's what your goal is, to restore integrity to the education conversation. The education conversation has gotten really ugly, hasn't it?
Absolutely, and that's exactly right. What's been incredibly frustrating, I remember even back when I first started teaching, I had an understanding of the inequities in our education system, but I really had no inkling at just how vilified the public school system and teachers in particular had become. I remember listening to, I would get up, before the sun had even risen, get ready to go to work, commute to work, spend all day teaching kids. After school, I'd be preparing lessons and scoring things and all the other stuff that goes along with becoming a teacher. And then I'd drive home, after dark. And I remember listening to the radio and hearing basically that I was responsible for all of the problems facing society. And it was just incredible to me, this disconnect between, what the day-to-day experience was for me as someone working in one of those quote-unquote failing schools, and seeing the hardworking people around me who were all doing their best.
Right.
And then hearing about how our public school system was doomed because of teachers and all this other stuff. And so it really, it was a really stunning experience to see that disconnect between reality and rhetoric that passes for an ed policy debate.
It really is. I got to tell you, just last week, we got another, hidden tape from courtesy of our friends at Mother Jones. And this time, it was New Mexico Governor Susana Martinez. And one of the recordings was her and one of her, I guess, either her campaign person or an aide or something. And she was just bad-mouthing teachers. And, God, they make enough money. Yeah, they don't even work for 3 months. And, and then the guy says, well, we have a solution. If it comes out that, during the campaign you said bad things about teachers, I know, we'll put up a YouTube video that no one will ever see, but it'll be there so that we can point to it and say, well, it's been on YouTube. I mean, that's the typical Republican way of doing things, is, lie, cheat, and steal. But the fact of the matter remains, that is the contempt with which they hold our teachers, right?
Absolutely. And what's funny, too, is that, number one, most Americans love our teachers. Teachers routinely, between 7 and 8 Americans out of 10 says that they trust and respect teachers. Yet, and any politician, Democrat or Republican, will kill for those numbers. And yet, they are, routinely spreading this narrative that, every problem, and this, stretches to all sorts of issues we face right now, but that every single problem is the result of a bad individual. So bad teachers, occasionally they'll blame parents, occasionally they'll blame the kids themselves. as opposed to, we've completely refused to adequately fund the system. We've given people an impossible task, and when they somehow manage against all odds to do incredibly good, if you look at, performance, graduation rates, college-going rates, et cetera, all those are higher than they've ever been. Yet they're still saying that everybody is a failure, et cetera. And so it's like, because we haven't managed to achieve the impossible. We've achieved the quite astounding against all odds, but we haven't gotten to the impossible, and therefore we're all failures. It's crazy.
It is crazy. There was just a report issued in the last day or two that the U.S. public high school graduation rates are up to 80%, projected to be up to 90% in the near future. That is, let me just say, that could happen as long as they stop cutting funding to public schools, which brings me to the next question. Sabrina Stevens is with us, teacher Sabrina on Twitter. She's the executive director of Integrity in Education. And so let me play devil's advocate for a moment and let you explain what's wrong with charter schools. What's wrong with charter schools? I mean, they're public schools, and it gives parents and students a choice of another school that they can go to instead of the one that is their local neighborhood school.
Well, for starters, our charter schools are fond of saying they're public schools until they get, for example, sued for violating the rights of students or teachers that public schools are meant to uphold, and then they say they're private. So there's a lot of times where, people try to have it both ways. They want to be public when it comes to funding, when it comes to access. They want to be private when it comes to actually providing equal access to all children or respecting the same types of rights. They want to be private when it comes to being exempt from regulations that would actually prevent a lot of the fraud and abuse that we see. So it's kind of this, they're trying to have it both ways in a lot of ways, and we need to address that across the country. That needs to be addressed. The other thing I have an issue with is that, school choice, and we talk about this a lot, is not often the choice of families and students. So a lot of times it is school districts making a choice, or, local developers in cahoots with private charter school companies and friendly elected officials who are making the choice about what schools people will go to. I'm a big fan of voice. We talk a lot about voice at Integrity in Education because we believe, if a community wants to have public school options, absolutely, go for it. If the community comes together and says, these are our assets, this is what we've got available to us, maybe we should have an art high school or something like that.
Right.
And they come together and come up with those options on their own.
But now what you're talking about...
That's how it should be.
Right. And for instance, I'm in Broward County, Florida, and we have those. Those are called magnet schools, and they're part of the public school system, and they're in the district. And yes, and you can apply to those magnet schools if you want, to specialize in your high school years in arts or in the sciences. And it's great. It really prepares kids, get in high school for their career. But those are not publicly funded private enterprises. And even those charter schools, and look, and there's two kinds of charter schools, right? There's the nonprofit charter schools, and then there's the for-profit charter schools. And sometimes the so-called nonprofit charter schools, they pay a pretty hefty salary to some of their principals, so they may be not for profit in its corporation charter, but in reality, there are some people getting really rich off of the money that should be used to educate our kids.
Absolutely. And that's the other really huge problem we see is that there was this original idea of giving some freedom, which, by the way, I think all schools should have. I don't think you should have to even be a selective enrollment school like a magnet school to be able to have a different focus if that's what the community wants.
Right.
But, what you do see a lot of is either these direct for-profit companies, so really, shady people like K-12 Inc., et cetera, that are directly profiting off of schools, or you have these kind of nonprofits in name only where they incorporate as a nonprofit and then they immediately outsource all of their operations to a corporate EMO that manages the school. And so then you have these issues where you see, it's like a land rush. People immediately see that there's money to be had. There's no, you don't have to have any credentials. You don't have to, and so much of a background check in some cases. And you can get access to millions of public dollars. And so that's a really huge problem that needs to be addressed.
I'm so glad you brought up K-12 because I have an article in front of me, and this just makes my blood boil. I remember, like at the beginning of the school year, I kept hearing all these commercials on the radio for K-12. It's a virtual online school. You could go, and then I did a little research into it. just because it didn't sound quite right to me. And K-12 has contracts with school districts all over the country where they get so much public money. If you pull your kid out of the public school and let them do the K-12 online virtual school curriculum, they will get money from your school district. And here's the headline from this article. Enrollment at nation's largest for-profit charter operator still growing despite lawsuits, regulatory problems. K-12 Inc. is facing a litany of regulatory problems and a new shareholder lawsuit, but as long as new students are signing up, none of that matters to investors. They are getting rich and richer and taking money out of our public schools at the expense of our kids' educations.
Absolutely. And what's really incredible about them in particular is, number one, it is widely recognized that what they're offering is subpar. So they, right now, recently the NCAA decided that they're not going to accept coursework from over a dozen of their schools in California. So for kids who were looking to be eligible for athletic scholarships in college, they don't get credit if they're at K-12 Inc. schools because they recognize that they're not giving a quality educational experience. Those kids are not going to be prepared for college. The other thing that is really insidious, especially from the advertising front, is the way they do it. I was watching TV with my stepdaughter a few weeks ago, and they were advertising on Nickelodeon. Wow. So we're sitting there, we're watching a show. Can you imagine? You want your kids to get a quality educational experience, and they're marketing directly to your child.
Oh, God.
They're sitting there saying basically, don't go to school every day when you could sit at home in front of your computer. It was outrageous. And so it was, this kind of, just the way that they use this marketing. And that's where a lot of their money goes because they don't have the same overhead costs, as a brick and mortar school. They don't have as many teachers. There's usually, a ratio of, sometimes 1 to 60, et cetera. And so their focus is primarily on enrolling new students. That's there's a teacher, Darcy Zadorfa, who's an incredible teacher, and she's in her doctorate program now. And she wrote about her experience as a K-12 Inc. teacher and how incredibly draining and heartbreaking it was because they were, she didn't have the ability to really connect with her students and make sure that they were getting the support that they needed. And she herself was overworked. She had this huge roster. Some of the full-time teachers, she says, have over 300 students that they're responsible for. And a lot of times the software that they use to even run the classes doesn't work. So, a lot of their time is spent not actually teaching, but helping kids figure out when there's a bug in the system.
Oh, no.
What are they going to do about it? I mean, it's just everywhere you turn, there are issues with this model.
Right.
And they're proposing it as though it's a solution. It's also funny, too, that they're caught up on test scores, and yet they perform half as well, even on test scores.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it. Hey, Sabrina, we're running short on time, but I want to ask you one other question, which is really disconcerting. Is that, look, in Florida, of course, we know Jeb Bush is one of the leaders of the school voucher idea and charters and all that. President Obama has shared the stage with Jeb Bush talking about charters, and now Howard Dean is getting. How are these people being so misled?
Well, what's interesting, too, so there's definitely been a lot of misinformation out there. And I think what's been really upsetting about the Democrats in particular is that they've kind of thrown education and teachers overboard as a way to, look bipartisan. So, and because a lot of people, unfortunately, really haven't done their homework on this issue. And so they hear the nice-sounding talking points from these, people looking to privatize schools. And then they just run with it, as opposed to really looking into, well, wait a minute, does this make sense? Does that add up? Is that really what we believe in? I think what's interesting, especially with people like, there was recently a blog post that students first posted saying that both Howard Dean and Elizabeth Warren were supportive of their views on schools. And actually, that's not true. So, what's interesting is that there's been misinformation as well from their side about who really is with them on the issue. Now, Howard has had some problems. His brother, owns a charter school or something like that. And so there's been some, kind of had some back and forth on where his views actually are. But something to keep in mind is that a lot of these folks really haven't been put up to speed. And so they kind of, I think a lot of us, especially for folks who identify as Democrats, have some work cut out for them to make sure that that folks are really all understanding what the real issues are.
They do. And, in fact, you can help them understand the real issues. Sabrina Stevens, find her at integrityandeducation.org. Go there. Sign up for their emails. You're doing great work. We're going to continue this conversation on my show at radioornot.com because there's so much more to talk about. Thank you, Sabrina. We'll talk later. Bye-bye. I'll tell you about our experience using sort of a voucher here in Florida. Next. Nicole for Randy. Don't go away. Randy will be back on Monday to bring us into the home stretch of the Randi Rhodes Show. I'm Nicole Sandler of RadioOrNot.com. And so, all right, here's the deal with here in Florida. My daughter actually will turn 15 on Saturday. My, how time flies, right? If you didn't know, I adopted my daughter. She was an 18-month-old toddler when I adopted her from an orphanage in Kazakhstan. And I just wanted to give this little creature the best of everything. I really wanted to make her life good, you know. And I believed that meant a public education. And so she's gone to school here in Florida. In fact, we moved back to Florida from California and Taos and New Hampshire, and back to Florida in time right before she started kindergarten. And Allison, as I said before, has ADHD, and so she's a smart kid. You know, a smart kid, but she has trouble focusing. She has trouble in a classroom situation. And so I learned about Florida has this thing called a McKay Scholarship, where if your child has an IEP, you know, they have a diagnosis and they have an individualized educational plan, and they get some form of accommodations, that you can access money from the state of Florida to use towards a private school. So I did that. Because it was only ADHD, she got the smallest amount. Well, if I tell you she spent 1.5 years in a private school and only wanted to go back to public school, and I made a deal with her. I said, you get straight A's by the winter break, this was this year, and I'll let you transfer to the public high school. She had an A in algebra in the private school, moved into the public school with an F. Okay, she got it up to a D, but she was failing because they were so behind, even though they assured me at that private school, oh, we teach to the state curriculum. She's going to be right there with the public school kids. She was so far behind when she moved into that public school. I'm telling you, the whole thing is a scam. It is dangerous. You want your kids to learn? Give them a good public education. Nicole for Randy.